Hello and welcome to this IFG event on science after coronavirus. My name's Tom Sasse. I'm an Associate Director at the IFG and I lead our work on policy making. I want to start by taking you back briefly to this day 1 year ago. Neil Ferguson had just published his bombshell report. Many of us had just started working from home. There would be another 4 days until the government announced a national lockdown. The model and businesswoman Caprice had just been mocked by a doctor on the Jeremy Vine show for asking whether we should be wearing masks and closing our borders. Few of us could have imagined then what an extraordinary year it would be, and scientists above all have had an extraordinary role in it. From the first lockdown decision through questions on social distancing and masks, treatments, testing, the R number, they've been front and centre advising policymakers and informing the public. Among other scientific achievements, the rapid creation and deployment of vaccines, described as a moonshot, has shown a capacity for collaboration and innovation that has led many to start thinking differently about future challenges. So science has had a huge role in the COVID crisis, but this morning we're going to explore the role the COVID crisis will have in changing science. What lessons should the science community learn about managing uncertainty, advising conflicted politicians, or communicating with a nervous public? How should the way science works change? For example, how scientists collaborate very quickly on problems. How can the UK become a science superpower? We have a brilliant panel to do it. Professor Peter Openshaw is Professor of Experimental Medicine at Imperial College London and one of the UK's leading immunologists. He's worked on respiratory viruses and influenza for over 30 years and is a member of the expert task force on immunology of COVID-19 and a member of the UK vaccine network. He was a member of SAGE, I think, during the swine flu crisis and has been at the coalface during this crisis as vice chair of NERVTAG, the Committee on New and Emerging Respiratory Viruses. Dr. Rupert Lewis is Chief Science Policy Officer at the Royal Society, where he focuses on improving the use of science by policymakers. Before that, he worked in government as head of the Government Office for Science, Go Science, where he was helping to develop advice that goes up to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet on all matters scientific. He was also responsible for strategic foresight projects and the science of emergency response. And before his time in Go Science, he held posts in the business department and in DEFRA. Dr. Beth Thompson is head of policy and advocacy for UK and EU at the Wellcome Trust. Her work focuses on ensuring that government policy and law support research and innovation through strong funding for research, access to talented people, and regulation that supports science while promoting public trust. She was awarded an MBE in the Queen's 2017 birthday honours for her work on EU data protection regulation. Before we get started, you can submit questions using the bar at the bottom of the screen. If you include your name and where you're writing from, please try and make them short and ensure that they are in fact questions. If you see someone else asking a question you like the sound of, just upvote it. We will be live tweeting this from the account IFG Events and using the hashtag IFG Science, and we'll have a video and sound recording of the event on our website tomorrow. I'd like to thank the Forum at Imperial College London, who are kindly supporting this event as part of a series. So Peter, I'm going to start with you, and I wanted to start with really the big issue of this week or today even. So over a dozen European countries will be restarting using the AstraZeneca vaccine today, having paused over concerns about a link with blood clots, which proved to be unfounded. What have the last weeks and months shown us about how different countries incorporate scientific evidence into political and regulatory decisions, and what challenges does that create for scientists?
Well, Tom, that's a huge question. I don't know where to start with it, really. I mean, specifically on the issues that have been to the forefront over the past week or so, I think it shows just how important it is that we have proper due deliberation and transparency over possible side effects. And I do think that the fact that these issues have been flagged and have been discussed so openly is a good thing in many ways, because it does show that the system is working and that nothing is being concealed. But I think it also shows just how unhelpful it can be to have a very, very long public debate, agonizing over detail before the detail has really become clear. And it's a very difficult balance to get in terms of openness, but at the same time being able to reassure people that, you know, this is the only exit strategy we've got, and that we must do everything we can to make sure that vaccine rollout is fast, and that people maintain confidence in vaccines. So I think communication to me is the key, and being open and honest with what's happening in science.
Mm. And it's interesting because some people have been pointing to this as just quite different regulatory philosophies and sort of where you put the sort of burden of proof and what level of evidence you need. On the other hand, you know, given the number of people who are being given these vaccines, there are presumably going to be all sorts of scares where sort of statistically you might see a sort of number of something happening, but statistically it doesn't really mean anything. So do you think that there's something that can be learned there for the future of this sort of vaccine rollout about how we treat those kind of scares, or in fact how other regulators abroad do that?
Yes, well, I think there's two things to say. One is that those of us who sat on many committees know that there is a sort of sociology of a committee that is almost inevitable in terms of the outcome, depending on how it's constituted, what the questions are that you put to it, and how they will be mindful of the optics of their decision making. And I think if you ask a committee to make a very specific decision over whether to suspend a vaccine rollout, then and don't ask them to consider the broader implications, then it's very tempting for that committee to say, yes, for safety, let's just suspend for 2 weeks, without having thought that that may result in thousands of deaths from people who are then not going to be vaccinated. So I think the other thing I wanted to say is that once a rare and difficult to diagnose event like cerebral venous thrombosis is flagged, the medical community are all going to start thinking, was that case I saw last week perhaps one of those? These are not cases that present themselves in a way that necessarily flags up to your attention that perhaps something a bit difficult to diagnose is going on here. And you just doing an ordinary CT scan won't actually show the presence of CVST in all cases. So I think, you know, the increase in awareness amongst the medical public will actually result in a big surge in cases of diagnosis, just because it's something that you don't necessarily think about when somebody presents with a headache and other rather odd neurological things that you can't quite fit together. So I do think we need to be forewarned that we're going to see a big surge in these diagnoses, just because it's been put into the awareness of the medical community.
That's a really interesting point, and a lot of people have warned about the sort of risks of disinformation just around the number of cases that you will get expectedly due to the sort of number of people we are vaccinating. I think that other point, which we might come back to, about the fact that the scientific policy process is not insulated from, you know, all these other actors, whether that's sort of doctors examining patients or indeed what's going on in other countries abroad. I just wanted to ask you another question, sort of casting your eye back. I mentioned that very first Neil Ferguson report. You've been there with NERVTAG. I think you were sort of meeting well before that, even as early as January. How would you sort of condense the lessons that you've learned? Obviously, this is not your first crisis, but the lessons you've learned about the role scientists play in advising policymakers. What do you think's gone well and badly?
Yes, well, I think it's a really interesting question, and I mean, I've been reflecting on how it is that we've got such a good, well-established mechanism for feeding scientific advice up to government, and yet we've ended up with one of the worst death rates in Europe. You know, how has that gone on? What's been the problem here? And I think there are many reasons that you could say that we've had a much higher death rate than some other countries, but I think some of it may be to do with a caution about accepting evidence that is not quite there. Caution amongst the scientific committees in really putting their money on the table when they think that more studies are needed, which of course they always are. I mean, for example, I think in the early days, we didn't really take into account some of the soft evidence that masks were useful. And the decision was made not to consume the nation's supply of PPE, which was rather sparse, by telling everyone to wear surgical masks at a time when they weren't really available. And that if an earlier decision on the basis of, the weight of evidence was made that masks actually would be quite a good thing under many circumstances, we might have had a lower death rate, for example. So there is a sort of caution and inertia in our scientific system. I think there are a number of things we did anticipate really well. The Academy of Medical Sciences report that came out in June last year was spot on in terms of how bad a winter we were going to get. You can almost overlay the actual data now onto the projection that we made with the advice of the epidemiologists. That was pretty amazing. And we got a lot of things right. I think we didn't quite anticipate the frequency with which new variants were going to arise. We thought that this was a relatively stable virus, but there's a lot we could talk about there. But I think we got a lot of things right. And looking back, I can see a few things that actually went a bit wrong.
That's really interesting. And of course, you've got this kind of very, elaborate structure of sort of SAGE and then all these subcommittees for pulling in a huge volume of evidence and then sort of synthesizing that and going up to policymakers. Two questions about that. I mean, do you think that structure has worked well enough in terms of actually bringing all the evidence in, and particularly evidence of what's happening abroad? And then secondly, is there anything about the way that evidence has then been communicated to policymakers that you think scientists need to reflect on? Because, I mean, you mentioned some of the issues about where scientists are putting the emphasis where there is uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, having been embedded in this for decades, that it does generally work pretty well. And you can see that what we say in our advisory committees is almost immediately on ministers' desks, because they quite often quote it in Parliament or on news broadcasts, sometimes within minutes of us actually making a recommendation. It is quite remarkable. And I don't think that happens in many other countries, although my knowledge of that is a bit limited. I think when I speak about this at European meetings, they're quite surprised that we have such a large and sophisticated network of scientific advisory committees, using some of the best brains in the country to try to digest the information that's out there and feed it up to government. So, I think potentially it works very, very well. I think we have to appreciate that there are other influences on the decision makers. There may be other people who are, chewing at the ankles of ministers for breakfast and supper. They may be trying to pull them in a direction that we're not trying to push them towards. So, they are in a difficult position sometimes of making a decision which is balanced by the scientific advice and by the political advice, which may be contradictory.
Rupert, a similar question to you. I mean, you look at this from the Royal Society, but you've also got long experience within government of sort of looking at how these science advice sort of functions from the inside. How would you describe the sort of strengths and weaknesses of that process that we've seen in the last year?
I would agree completely with Peter. I mean, the UK does have a huge set of science advisory mechanisms in most, if not all, government departments. And SAGE was the culmination of that in terms of its role in feeding science advice to COBRA meetings. And when I was in GoScience, we would regularly have other governments come and see us to say, we really like your SAGE system, how can you help? I think there's a huge difference though between when you exercise and practice for such events and the reality. And there's nothing like experience. You look at the way that nations like Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam have reacted. They have real experience of this kind of thing from past infectious diseases. And SARS and MERS and so on didn't really touch the UK that much. So I think part of our sort of inertia, as Peter described it, is inevitable from the fact that this was completely new to us. I do think as well that, as Peter said, the science advice is only one part of the policy decision making. Policymaker needs to think also, what's the cost, what are the risks, what are the feasibility, what's acceptability, and that's quite a complex mix. And the science advice is just part of that. I mean, SAGE just gives the science advice, and the decision making process is complex. And I guess from the outside, we're not particularly cited on it. We gave advice on masks, for example, in the Royal Society, where there was quite a lot of inertia on that particular question. But we only gave advice on the efficacy of masks, which is pretty clear. Government would then need to think how much they cost. As Peter said, are we going to drain the limited PPE supply? So the decision-making process has to consider many more issues.
Do you think that broader advice should be more transparent? I mean, it's interesting that we have this expectation around scientific advice being quote unquote independent, but also being transparent, and the issue of sort of SAGE publishing its minutes has become a big factor in the sort of political process. Do you think we should also have the economic advice, other forms of advice?
Yeah, I do actually, and it is interesting when you speculate on the number 10 briefings. We have the chief medical officer, got the chief scientist up there. We don't have the chief economist of government. Is describing the wider picture, and that's a gap. And I think that's led to months ago this sort of almost question of competition between the public health goals and the economic goals, rather than what are the right trade-offs for the nation. So it does feel as if the wider parts of the evidence that was used could have done with more exposure. And SAGE has become extremely transparent. Not that it wasn't before, it's just that before there wasn't the pressure to do this. And SAGE participants were focused on getting the job done, going through the emergency, and publication was not the urgent priority. I think it's a good thing that SAGE now has put a lot more resources into the publication of their evidence. It is a way of holding the public sector more to account on the decisions that they're making, which I think is very useful. And it would be great to see that replicated across more kinds of evidence. Though have to recognise that there's a lot of resources required to do that well and quickly.
I wonder what you think about bringing these disciplines together a bit more. So, I mean, one of the things we've seen a bit in this crisis is SAGE being in one box, the Treasury having its own economic advice being over here with a sort of slightly different view. There's been calls on the outside, people saying you need economic and epidemiological modelling to be done together. There's been some people saying put economists on SAGE. We at IFG didn't think that would particularly solve it. Other people say, no, the Cabinet Office needs to be doing a much better job at bringing this all together. I mean, you've been there at the centre of government. What do you think about that question?
I think fundamentally taking a broader approach is always a good thing. So in the Royal Society, we've done some publications particularly on bringing epidemiologists and economists together. Our Delve Data Science Research Group published an early paper on that. We've done a paper on schools where we considered the science and the effect on education and so on. So it's quite wide. We've done papers on vaccines where we've included social research with colleagues from the British Academy on vaccine hesitancy and so on. Those are really important things for policymakers to think about. And it might be the case that scientists by themselves wouldn't necessarily consider all those wider issues. So I think it is really important. And I guess the other issue is that if you bring in other disciplines, it can change quite significantly the way you frame a question in the first place, and that can lead to quite different policy conclusions. So my personal view is that it is very good to take a broader perspective right from the start, and particularly while you're trying to figure out what the question really is.
And one last question on the structures. So we've seen a little bit of the kind of early warning shots of some of the battles that are going to happen in a public inquiry in the last few weeks. and some of sort of people, number 10 or wherever, pushing back and saying SAGE is going to be reviewed, we're going to look at that process. Do you think the model is broadly right? And one of the criticisms that perhaps has been that we've stuck with SAGE for far too long in this crisis. It was only designed to be a temporary structure, and actually it's been going for a year now. So do you think there should be a sort of protocol for that around how you move to a departmental response?
So whilst the most departments have chief scientific advisors, I think it's worth remembering that the model is not that old. It came in the probably just post BSE and foot and mouth, and it's taken time to evolve. And naturally, when that happens, you get the science-heavy departments have probably quite strong advisory systems, and others that don't automatically imagine they need it might have weaker systems. So I think there's a good question to ask about. I think SAGE has basically stepped into the gaps and has been much more broadly tasked than it was designed for. That's been a good thing because SAGE has mechanisms that work. Longer term, though, it does seem that it would be really worth asking sort of slightly wider questions about government science capability as a whole, and individual departments, where they need to be, what their systems need to look like for sort of future events of this nature.
Brilliant. And just before I come to Beth, I've got a question here from Michael Paisley, Rupert, which relates to this. So he's asking, given the different political approaches to challenges like pandemic, climate across the UK, is it time for the devolved governments to develop their own independent science policy?
That's a fascinating question, and gosh, there could be many answers to that. It is certainly the case that if you look just geographically at the devolved administrations, they have different science problems. I think it's probably more useful to frame this more widely. So if you take the pandemic, we have the same emergency happening across all nations, and so getting the best advice we can, and all nations being able to use that advice, seems to be a very good thing. If you take, say, the implementation of sort of social measures at local level, then different areas have different problems. The situation that you would, the social measures you need in Cornwall would not be the same as the ones you need in say, Manchester. So I think there's a wider question about local science advice and local authorities and science advice that is pretty interesting, because the needs are very different from one place to another. But I think on the broader question of where we have common problems, then everybody being able to access the common science is obviously a good thing. But where issues localize, then local advice is also a good question to examine.
So would you consider sending some of your former colleagues from Go Science out to the regions as part of these sort of dispersals that we're seeing with the Treasury or other departments to try and get a bit more of a regional sense in the UK's policy? Or
I think for policymakers in general, it is always a good thing to see what happens at policymakers spend most of the time in Whitehall historically, and that is not where you get a sense of how the real world works and what really happens as a result of your policy. So I think it's a good thing in general for all actors in these, be it scientists, policymakers, or whoever, to see the operational side of what they're advising on, and why not disperse them to where they're most needed.
I'm sure they'll thank you for that. Beth, come to you. So Wellcome's one of the biggest funders, spending about $1 billion a year supporting research. Jeremy Farrar has been sort of lauded for his roles in sort of helping us, identify COVID treatments and things like that. It's been really sort of front and center. Have you been surprised at the kind of speed with which scientific collaboration, whether that's on the funding side or just on methods, has sort of evolved during this crisis?
I think it's been really fascinating to see something that in the research community we talk about quite glibly. So the importance of international collaboration, the importance of bringing disciplines together. Those are things that we've said, we've talked about their importance, but actually seeing it happen and the speed and scale at which it's happened has been phenomenal. And I think we've not always been great at articulating the benefits of that global collaboration, but the nature of this global problem, I think, has made it much clearer for all of us why it has to happen. And we can only solve a global problem like this, but the same goes for things like climate change. When we bring together those different perspectives from around the world, when we bring together the capacity and capability of more than one country in order to kind of turn our attention on one problem. And in a sense, I'm not surprised how it's worked in this case, because in an emergency and in a crisis, I think it really galvanizes efforts and it helps people kind of come together around a common problem. But I think actually what's really interesting is how we can learn from this and apply this to other global problems in future. But I think, we've seen it's also not just about international collaboration, it's about how we work together across different sectors. So bringing together academia, small and large industry, so small biotechs through to the big pharma companies, philanthropies like Wellcome and the Gates Foundation, and then working with the big multilateral organizations as well as governments. And this has been a fantastic example of how we can do that. I think one of the things we're yet to crack in all of that is we've done some of the science brilliantly. I think we couldn't have predicted how well it's gone in terms of creating the number of effective vaccines that we have, but we have to work out how to get those to people as well and how to do that equitably, because the science is only useful if we actually put it to use. So that is one of the challenges that we're definitely still grappling with across the community.
Brilliant. And I want to come back to some of those sort of UK science questions in just a moment, but just on the sort of international collaboration piece, I don't know if you saw, Yuval Noah Harari had an interesting piece in the FT the other week where he was saying that scientists have been collaborating despite politicians not really cooperating, and sort of making the point that you've seen this big increase in scientists working together. Do you think that sort of lack of political cooperation, if you accept that that's been the case, has sort of held that back at all, or do you think actually that scientists can just get on with it and the best institutions in the US can pick up the phone to you at the Wellcome Trust and it sort of works okay?
I think it's part of the nature of research that people collaborate, and lots of collaboration was happening before the pandemic, and I actually think there haven't been huge blocks and barriers to researchers doing that and just getting on with it. It's been great to see how effectively it has worked. I think one thing we need to think about in the future is that when we're responding to a crisis and we need the sheer volume of research that we've got going on at the moment, is how we pay for it. And in this crisis, we've been fundraising as we go for some of the huge R&D efforts and the collaborations through things like the ACT Accelerator, which is a big international platform. But to be fundraising and actually doing the R&D at one time is not a very effective way to do it, and ACTA is still having to raise money. So I think we need to think about, for these really big global problems, how do you share the burden of risk and benefit to help the system? And that's where really the politics and the science collaboration come together. So on a very practical day-to-day level, I don't think things have held us back, but ultimately these things need money to support them.
And take us into those sort of funding questions, because you would hope that this huge success of science in the crisis has in one way sort of open the floodgates of funding, and we hear politicians saying they want the UK to be a science superpower. On the other hand, your own organisation, many others in the science community have been pointing out, we've got this cut to ODA funding, we've got potentially less money being made up through the Horizon funding. So what do you think is the outlook for that funding question?
I mean, this is the question of the week. As you say, I think we've seen what science can do. We know that the government has a vision for what science can do. The integrated review set that out really clearly, this idea of the value that UK science can bring to the rest of the world and the value that it brings to the UK itself. And we can quibble with whether science superpower is the term we would all choose to use, but I think many in the research community can really get behind that sense that we have something really great to offer. We have a leadership contribution to make. But at the moment, we're seeing rhetoric that is not matched by action, and the government putting its money where its mouth is. We have very positive words in terms of the long-term trajectory for science spending. that's really good news. But at the moment, that there just isn't the evidence that that's happening. And as you say, we've got cuts to the ODA budget that are linked to the drop from 0.7 to 0.5% GNI. That is stopping some projects in their tracks. Money that people were expecting to have over the next financial year isn't going to them. So that is going inevitably to damage research projects and damage partnerships in a way that is really tragic at a time that we can see the benefit that this should be doing in the world. So that on one side is terrible. We also have Horizon as a really powerful mechanism for collaboration across Europe. It's the EU's funding programmes. We were all delighted that the UK was able to fully participate in that as part of the Brexit deal, but we don't know where the roughly £1 billion to pay for that is going to come from in the next financial year. And the risk seems to be that will come out of the rest of the science budget. So we need the government to match its action to its words, quite simply.
Rupert, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just to follow on Beth's comments, I think what in the science world we probably need to be better at communicating the realities of the investment. So it's not that the Oxford Vaccine Group has suddenly invented a great vaccine. It's that they've done 10 years of research in vector technology, which took a lot of time and effort. And research capacity, the UK has astonishing research capacity, but it is a fragile thing. And if you do stop-start funding or cut funding, it's easy for the capacity to disappear. It takes long time, years to get it back, and that's if our competitors don't steal the march on us and fill the gap. So I think both applied and basic research, the PCR technology that's behind almost all of the testing came from a obscure research on hot spring bacteria. That kind of link. There's so much basic research that has come together in as Peter said, the only way out now, and getting that across to policymakers and politicians is probably something we need to really do as well as we can.
Peter, you wanted to come in?
Yes, so I'd just like to also just contribute a bit to this discussion. The risk of sounding rather sort of ingratiating to the Wellcome Trust, that they, in my program about maybe 15 years ago, agreed to fund it, but said you can't drop the human component. So they steered me from very basic research into doing human studies. And then with the Mosaic study in 2009, when they asked me to lead a pandemic response to influenza, they said, you can lead it, but you can't do it all from Imperial. It has to be a nationwide effort, taking the best British science you can, and you have to distribute it. And I think that has been a model for the PREPARE consortium in Europe, and now for the ISRIC 4C consortium. It was a trailblazer in terms of setting down how to do science. And I really take my hat off to those funders, including the Wellcome and the MRC, who've invested for years in this. All of this hasn't happened just by chance from nowhere. It all goes back to the Common Cold Unit that was set up after the Second World War and funded by the Medical Research Council until it was shut down about 1988 or so. So, there's been decades, maybe centuries of investment in this country in science excellence, which is why we have been able to do what we've done and to really contribute on a global stage. And it's that very, very long-term funding and also sort of benevolent steerage from the funders in ways which are actually really helpful.
Peter, we had your colleague Robin Shattuck on this virtual stage a couple of weeks ago, and he was making the point that Pfizer and Moderna have benefited from decades of financial backing in the US and in Germany. And actually, one of the reasons we haven't managed to develop an mRNA vaccine here in the UK is because that hasn't been quite so consistent. The other point that several people have made, I think, is that in some ways the UK vaccine success was driven by its sort of particular strengths. A handful of elite institutions, particular strength in pharmaceuticals, but it doesn't necessarily provide a template for some of the sort of broader sort of uses of science that the government might like to imagine. So would you argue that we need to see a bit of a change in the model there?
Well, I think we've been doing really well, and I think the NIHR funding that's gone, the National Institute for Healthcare Research funding that Sally Davis was very, very prominent in championing, has had a major effect in developing clinical science in this country. I'd also flag up the regulatory and ethical aspects, that have allowed us to be the first country in the world to do human infection challenge in volunteers just in the last 2 weeks with coronavirus. And these are extraordinarily powerful studies in terms of not only discovering things about the biology, but also fast-tracking vaccine development and the development of novel therapeutics. So I do think there are some real strengths here, which again come from long-term funding and investment.
Sorry, Beth, did you want to come in on that?
I think Peter's making a really important point there, and there's, for me, a lesson that we need to learn for the future. So there are some things we've managed to do at unprecedented speed and scale while maintaining quality, and I'd add the recovery trial to that list, which has been phenomenally successful across the UK. And Peter's point about the ethics and the regulation is so important, because I think because it's been a crisis, our regulators, who had lots of strengths to start with, have really approached this with a kind of can-do, how do we facilitate this as much as possible? And that made things like recovery possible. It made sure they could happen really quickly. And I think it's about a year to the day they recruited their first patient, which is quite incredible. We have to make that business as usual in the UK after the pandemic and learn those lessons. We can't always do everything at immense speed because there wouldn't be capacity, but we have to learn, I think, about what it teaches about us about risk and opportunity, and apply that much more frequently, and use that brilliant capability we have across the NHS to run this kind of thing at scale, because that could be an enormous strength for the UK in the future.
And one of the benefits of leaving the EU, perhaps, is that sort of regulatory nimbleness that you could carve out on your own. Rupert, I wanted to come back to you on this funding question. We've been talking about the sort of 2.4% target, and it, for us on the outside, some of us might imagine that government just has a big lever it can pull and it can sort of suddenly drive up R&D investment. Why is that so hard? You were sort of mentioning that actually, it's been a target for a long time.
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons is because within that overall picture of R&D intensity, only a third of the funding is from government, and the other 2/3 is from the private sector, and half of that is from overseas. So it's not just about government investment. I mean, it's partly about making the case again and again through different political cycles. But it's also about what can the government do to make the UK really, really attractive to foreign direct investment of one kind or another, and local investment. And that's not that easy. And I guess another issue in the last decade has been that, again, I think one of the strengths that Peter and Beth have alluded to on the biomedical side is Medical Research Council and NIHR funding, which have been consistent policy sort of through different political cycles. If you look wider on the innovation landscape, we've had a variety of different industrial strategies. In the last couple of years, sort of a bit of an absence of industrial strategy, an innovation strategy that might come along in a few months. So there's been an inconsistency, and that's not that good for the science world, that sort of patchy approach. And it doesn't give investors, you learn one thing and then it changes and you have to learn another thing. So it makes it slightly more difficult for the investment world, I think, to contribute.
We've got an R&D roadmap. Beth, you might want to come in on this as well. I mean, do you think that roadmap sort of gives any sense of direction there? I mean, I take your point on the sort of changing industrial strategies and so on.
Yeah, I mean, the roadmap asks all the right questions, and I mean, it largely does that. It largely asks a lot of questions. So it's not yet in the space of giving a clear sense of direction about where policy is going. There are a few hints there that are sort of bullets to bite that the UK policymakers probably have not sort of bitten fully on over the years. And one of them is the idea in the roadmap that there needs to be bigger bets in a small number of areas. You know, we're a small country. Can we continue to try to do everything? Or do we need to try to figure out where our strengths really are and support them? And if we do that, the conundrum of how do you know where a new strength is going to be in 10 years' time if you don't let this sort of plant seeds? So at least the roadmap flags up that rather fundamental issue, which is helpful. It remains to be seen the extent to which, you know, the question, the rhetoric, if you like, will be translated into reality.
Beth, do you want to come in on that?
I agree with everything that Rupert said. It sets a helpful trend and sense of direction, but it doesn't help us really answer some of those crunchy policy choices that we're going to face yet. But what we have seen is the pieces of work start to trickle down from the R&D roadmap. So things like the people and culture strategy coming up, and also that work on the place agenda. I actually think in terms of people and culture, we've learned things through the pandemic that help us think through some of those challenges. So things like the inequities in the impacts on researchers working through the pandemic. So those with caring responsibilities have had a really tough time. That doesn't really do it justice, but it's been enormously difficult to keep up your research career while trying to manage your other responsibilities. And funders and government are going to have to think through cleverer ways to take that into account. And if we can do that now, can we do that in the future? Can we get better at saying what's this individual circumstances and what contribution are they making, and are those things proportionate rather than expecting the same from everyone? So I think there's promise in the roadmap in terms of the direction it's heading in, but lots more work to be done, and that's just one small example.
And I wanted to pick up this question of methods. We talked a bit about this sort of flourishing of preprints, as well as sort of changes in the funding landscape. The fact that actually the way scientists are sharing what they're doing and peer reviewing is changing. What do you see as the sort of long-term consequences of that? And is there a need to sort of develop new sort of expectations around how you ensure quality?
I think what's been really helpful is to see things like preprints becoming a norm. And I think that's been accelerated through the pandemic. Some of the journals have made their all of their COVID work open access, which has also been a great thing to see. So I think it's helping us push on some of those things that are really good for the community, and catalyse those, effectively make them happen more quickly than they would have done otherwise. But you're right that there's this tension between pace and rigor some of the time, or at least those things haven't gone through as many checks as they would have done when they've been published. I don't think we're ever going to get a perfect answer to that, but it's partly about how we share and communicate the findings and people understanding the risks that come that come attached. I think we all want to see research that's really high quality, whether that's in preprint form or once it's been published. We know the peer review system doesn't always catch mistakes anyway, so I think that expectation of rigor is something that all of us across the system have to find ways to reinforce. But fundamentally, early sharing is good. Other disciplines have been doing this actually for much longer than the biomedical sciences, and I think we've got things to learn there. But understanding the status of that research and communicating it clearly and without kind of over-egging something that it still might be uncertain feels to me like the best way to manage it, and goes back to some of Peter's early comments about the importance of communicating uncertainty, and that we know that's not easy, but it's doable. Yeah.
Peter, I'll let you respond to that, and then I've got a couple of questions from the audience on vaccines, which I want to put to you.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Beth about early publication and the value of it. I think it has meant that things have moved with enormous speed, because we're not having these months of delay while the referees, particularly referee 3 is always a bad one, goes through your manuscript and holds it up and asks for more experiments. But on the other hand, it does mean that as soon as something is out there, you get journalists on the line, extrapolating from from your comments into some disaster scenario, which you then have to try and nip in the bud. So it's led to enormous intensity at a time when, you know, many of us are under great personal and social pressures as well. It has been a quite unprecedented year for all of us, I think.
No, that's really interesting, and there's been some, as I know, in the journalistic world, arguing for sort of certain standards around only reporting things if you can see the underlying data, you know, not going on the basis of press releases and things like that. We've seen some big issues with the, you know, Handelsblatt, the newspaper in Germany, reporting on the vaccines. A couple of questions here. So one from Ron Marchant, who asks Peter, does the fact that the major vaccine manufacturers aren't amongst those with approved products tell us anything about the research models they use, and does it suggest how those models might change?
I'm just wondering, I don't know if others want to comment on that as well. I mean, I think it's interesting that AZ really stepped up to the plate and put in a major investment into something which they were committed not to make a profit from during the pandemic. And really, there was a commitment to public good from many of our major manufacturers in terms of, you know, sharing ideas, maybe sharing reagents that went into vaccines. You know, a vaccine isn't just the protein, or the RNA, it's the things that go with it, like the adjuvants, which enhance the immune response. So there has been quite a lot of sharing of skills and techniques between manufacturers as well, which I think has been a very, very good thing in terms of accelerating the development of all these effective vaccines. I'm not sure if that was really.
No, I think that got to the thrust of it, and obviously, you know, sort of cooperation on trials and all sorts of things like that. And a related question here from Keith, Peter, which I also put to you first, but welcome others to come in. He asks, if the production of vaccines show the value of international cooperation, do the problems with distribution not show the dangers of the nationalism, which is still very attractive to political leaders?
I think that's for somebody else, really.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if any of my panel will want to come in and
I can take that one briefly. I think we have seen signs of that kind of vaccine nationalism emerging, but as we at Wellcome have said on many occasions before, there is an enormous value and in us working together on the manufacturing issues, on the equity issues, equitable access, and sharing those vaccines around the world. It's actually informed self-interest to do that. So although it may seem appealing to close your boundaries, to look inwards, to say we all need our own manufacturing capacity and we're going to rely on what we can produce in our country, it's not a practical solution at the end of the day. So we need that international cooperation to make it work. So I think it's a worrying trend that we've seen, but also countered by some brilliant efforts to collaborate internationally to solve those problems. And we're not going to win. We can't use these tools, which are our only exit strategy, unless we make that work and we make sure that we've got access for everyone.
Absolutely. Rupert, I've got a question here, which I'm going to put to you, from David Black, who says, as a PPI person, I don't know what PPI is, but I think it's something to do with science communication, because he says, as a PPI person, I've been really disappointed by how science has been communicated to lay citizens. Do we need more scientific communicators who are better able to effectively tell the story to the public?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is yes. And I guess one of the issues that the pandemic has really shone a light on is the fact that in general, the science community like to do their work, and that's their strength. Science being in the limelight is a somewhat new experience for many people. And it's something for which you know, it's not that common when you do a PhD to say have a training module on communication. There are, and that's changed quite a lot in the last decade or so. So the Science Media Centre and other such groups have done a fantastic job of bringing you know, scientists who want to communicate and are good at communicating into the public sphere. There are some really good science journalists in the UK in the tabloids and the broadsheets that do a fantastic job of communicating science well. But I think the general answer is yes. It's scientists who are publicly funded, the public probably has a good rationale for sort of asking them to answer the question, what are you doing and why does it matter to me? So scientists in general having a sort of high level of awareness of that need is important. And if we can boost the Science Media Centre's efforts in some way, shape or form, and universities have become better at supporting their scientists in recent years through communication as well, that's also a good thing. I think it has exposed something of a gap between the day job of most scientists and what the public would like to know about.
And I take your point completely on the sort of Science Media Centre role and the way that scientists have been thrust onto, radio programs every morning. I heard Peter on the Today programme only this week. What do you think about the sort of press conferences, the daily press conferences, and the way those have worked as a way of communicating science? We've seen, in one sense, it's great that we've got sort of Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty up there all the time explaining things. On the other hand, you've had some criticism about, quite dense slideshows, and perhaps it's also quite difficult for them standing alongside the politicians to always be perfectly clear about what the scientific evidence is. What do you think that works as a format?
I think in general it has, and I should say I think it's really hard. If you trying to explain very technical things is never an easy thing to do, and doing it under the pressure of a press conference where you've got the Prime Minister standing beside you is probably it's not the daily kind of pressure that most scientists are very used to. And I think you can see that their abilities and the technology that they've used has probably improved as their experience has gone and time has passed. The PowerPoints are definitely better than they were at the beginning, but it's a very hard thing. I think you have to admire any scientist that puts themselves out there in the public sphere to communicate. Particularly given, we've run quite a few press conferences for some of our COVID publications. Some of the reactions to scientists are extremely negative, and scientists have to be quite brave and quite fixed in to come out and be public on this kind of thing.
Mm. Peter.
Yes, well, thank you. I would actually challenge David Black on this. I think his in his question he says he's been disappointed by how science has been communicated. I've actually been really encouraged. I think that we have some enormously good science journalists who communicate science brilliantly. If you think back 20 years ago, the only time that science ever got a look in on TV and radio was as a joke. It was never depicted in the richness and excitement that it is now depicted by the news media and newspapers and so on. It is quite fantastic to me to see how much it has improved. And I think that if you look at the vaccine acceptance rates in the UK, I actually think some of that can be put down to the wealth of good communication that's been done on behalf of the vaccine science community. And I do think, we are listening absolutely to patient panels in all our grants now. They're often involved in writing the applications, and they're listened to throughout the making of policy. And that's all to the good. I actually would challenge David Black about this. I think we've done a pretty damn good job, I'd say.
No, that's quite right to have the pushback, Peter. And I think you're completely right that, as a Today programme listener, you're sort of used to having the sort of 7:45, what are the wacky scientists up to now slots traditionally. And actually now we've got scientists on there all the time explaining some of these issues in a lot of complexity. I wanted to move us on because we're running out of time, and I wanted to bring up a question. One of our members of the public has brought it up, but also this question of international fora and the way that they're supporting some of this work of science. So John Charlesworth says the WHO has come in for criticism since the start, but on the international scale of coordinated development in the future, what changes does it need to make any improvement in a global response? Beth, I wonder if I could come to you on that sort of, the sort of global architecture for this.
I think WHO have been doing a great job in lots of ways through a really challenging time, but this has exposed one of the challenges of the setup of WHO, which is that they've got a huge mandate, a big task to do, but actually quite little power to deliver some of that with. And I think that's going to be one of the questions that we're going to have to look at as we come through the pandemic, in terms of how the world can respond better next time. I think without doubt there's an important question about how we finance the response. So both in terms of the R&D that's needed that I talked about earlier, but also things like the early warning systems that we need to have in place. Although those things are expensive, it's an insurance against a hugely expensive pandemic, and we've spent so much more on responding to this and dealing with the financial fallout than we had preparing for it in the first place. And I think that's one of the big changes that the world needs to think through, is how do you create better investment and also and create the governance systems that can then support that.
Rupert.
Yeah, I just want to come in on Beth's point on how do we pay for it, and there's a how do you pay for resilience? How do you do the insurance policy? It's not, if you're a health minister in kind of peacetime, it's quite hard to justify putting large amounts of money into warehouses full of PPE when you're short of frontline nurses and doctors. If you look at the financial sector, they have different mechanisms now. They have central banks running stress tests. They've increased capital ratios. So I think it's worth, in the future, a debate to provoke would be, how do we pay for resilience in a way that ministers are not conflicted in their day jobs on how to do that?
I think that's such an important question. It's one we'll certainly be looking at the IFG, because it's very, as you say, it's sort of governments tend to sort of in the immediate aftermath of the crisis say this all needs to change, and then sort of 2 or 3 years later the sort of pressures of day-to-day spending re-emerge. We're running up to the end of time. I wanted to pick up one final question, which was just around the international cooperation on vaccines in particular. Rupert, we were just talking about sort of getting the funding together. We've got initiatives like COVAX, CEPI, that are sort of trying to do this. Do you think that there is starting to be anywhere near like enough international cooperation to get the money behind that, or are we still a very long way off that?
It's something that Peter, I'm sure, knows a great deal about more than I do, but I think the big question on funding, once the developed world is obviously racing ahead. If the developing world is not properly supported and helped, and things happen slowly, then we just create more risk. So I think there's a huge question about how to scale up the funding to do what the UK has done, rapid rollout. The emergence of variants depends on time and density of infection. So how can that be minimized at a global level? That's a huge funding question.
And just before I come to Peter and Beth for final comments, Rupert, one more question, which I think might be a good one for you here, from Philip Shapira from the University of Manchester, who asks, has there been an underappreciation of the importance of social and behavioural science in the pandemic scientific advice, and how could this be addressed in future?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think funders and all science academies and so on always talk about interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity as a good idea. Everyone starts in their own field. There have been quite a lot of efforts to incorporate, as we in the society have tried to do, social research and behavioural science in some of our advice, which is a good thing. But it's not easy. It takes more time, it takes more effort, it creates more debates. But I don't know if there's been enough. But certainly I think it's really, really important to keep trying, and that's a good thing in the R&D roadmap is to highlight that.
Peter, final reflections from you on the very rich discussion.
Yes, it's hard to know where to start, really. Just on that last point, I think there's been some very interesting, rather sort of philosophical dissertation on what it is that promotes the holding of anti-science or extreme views, and maybe gives you a passport into membership of a social group that otherwise you might be excluded from. But there's so much to say on that. I mean, in conclusion, what I'd like to say is just what an amazing year we've had in terms of showing the power of science and the way in which, long-term support for science and investment in science can have such great benefits for society. And I just hope that in the future we can maintain that and enhance science funding rather than finding ways to cut it, which I think would be disastrous at this present moment.
Beth, final thoughts from you, and perhaps tell us what Wellcome is going to be focusing on over the next years.
I think this discussion shows the incredibly valuable role and the essential role that science has played in helping us work through what has been an incredibly bleak and difficult challenge. And as Peter said, we need to, as a community, be able to explain that, I think, really well, make that case for funding, and I hope the government will take those lessons and listen. But I think we can also learn things about how science has worked that we've talked about today, and I hope that we'll keep those after the crisis and continue to build on them in terms of the way science works, the way clinical trials work. Infection in the future is going to become one of Wellcome's 3 health challenges alongside mental health and climate change. So keep watching this space. We will still be here and very active in it.
Brilliant. And Rupert, did you want to offer any final thoughts and tell us about Royal Society's work?
Sure. So I sort of echo the others' perspectives on funding. Obviously, I mean, this extraordinary response that the science community has done has been built on decades of funding. And the future of the UK's economy, science funding is so central to that on basic research and on innovation. But I'd just like to finish on so the Royal Society's the other 2 existential crises that we're working on, which is climate change and biodiversity. They are slow motion, and so much more difficult cognitively to engage on, and yet very, very serious. So I guess a question for us in terms of overall resilience is how we can increase our policy and political support for real action in those areas, and how there are crises. How can we treat them as a crisis?
Brilliant. Thank you, Rupert, and thank you all. That was a really strong call for learning the lessons from this crisis, but also maximising the role of science in the UK and indeed internationally going forward. So thank you very much to my brilliant panel, and thank you to your questions, those of you who are watching, and thanks again to the forum at Imperial College for sponsoring this event. If you enjoyed the discussion, we have a final one of our series with Imperial on the role of technology in reaching net zero, taking us into some of the questions Rupert was just mentioning there. That will be on Monday the 29th, that's Monday week, and we'll be hearing from Jürgen Meyer, the former boss of Siemens, among others. But thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now.